history, circumcision's always pulled out as, well, maybe it cures this, maybe this is what it's for, right? And I think HIV is the next step in that trend. Everything came to the forefront when 3 trials were conducted in Africa, and one was conducted in Uganda, one in Kenya, and one in South Africa. And what these trials showed was that circumcising men in these defined populations decreased the chance of female-to-male HIV transmission. And these studies were powerful studies in terms of their size and how they were protocoled. They were a randomized controlled trial where half of the males were circumcised and half of them were left intact. And then they just followed them, and at 2 years' time they looked and assessed which of these groups had the most rates of HIV infection. And I'll show you the results from these trials, but it's important to note that each one of these lead authors is not an infectious disease HIV expert, okay? O'Vare, Bailey, and Gray, these are circumcision proponents. These are authors who have published over 100 separate articles about the benefits of circumcision for other medical conditions. So these weren't public health people saying, how can we address this terrible epidemic in Africa? These were Western circumcision proponents looking to export circumcision to the world's poorest and least educated people. And probably to do so in order to justify its continuation in North America. Okay? It works over here, wouldn't it be better if we did this to our children here? So the news always says it's a 50% reduction in relative risk. These studies show that if you circumcise your child, you've decreased their chances of catching HIV by 50%. That's always the bottom line that the newspapers say. Well, here are the exact numbers. So the red numbers are the actual cases of HIV. So in the South African trial, after 2 years, 45 cases of HIV in the intact group and only 20 in the circumcised group. And the trend is pretty similar. Here, 45, half the number in the circumcised group. Kenya, about the same, half the number. So it looks like it's true. It decreases the chances of contracting HIV by 50%. But that's the relative risk. The absolute risk is not quite as impressive. So it's 45 out of 1,582, which is about 2.84% of the intact subjects contracted HIV, 1.3% of the circumcised subjects contracted HIV. So the absolute difference is 1.6%. Okay, it's very, very small. So after 2 years, the chance that you've decreased your risk of HIV infection by 1.6% overall. Okay, so it's much less impressive. It's doesn't sell as many newspapers, and it doesn't sell as many circumcisions in North America, which is one of the reasons we don't see the absolute risk reduction as well. Now, some of the flaws, the methodological flaws with these studies, they're too numerous to go over, but I'll point out a few of them. First of all, there was a lead time bias. So they circumcised half of the group, and they couldn't have sex for 6 to 8 weeks while they recovered from their surgery. Okay, they were out of commission, so to speak. Whereas the intact group had an extra 2.5 months to potentially contract HIV. And these studies, all of them showed that the highest rates of HIV contraction were early on in the study, within the first 3 to 4 months. So you have lead time bias here because the intervention group, the circumcised group, has 2 to 3 less months to get HIV. They didn't correct for that. They did not correct for the percentage of female sex workers living in the counties where these men lived. That's the single greatest risk factor for contracting HIV in Africa, is the percentage of females who are in the sex trade in the county that you live in. They did not contract. They didn't consider the per exposure risk. So one individual may have contacted HIV after 1 sexual encounter. One may have contracted HIV after 250 sexual encounters. They didn't control for that, okay? So they didn't look at how many sexual partners and actually how many sexual encounters the HIV positive subjects actually had. So there's variability there as well. They didn't control for malaria. Malaria is the single greatest factor for HIV viral load in the bloodstream of people who are infected. People that have malaria have much higher viral loads, are much more likely to pass HIV onto their sexual partners. And the worst criticism for this trial is after 2 years, they say, well, these results are so compelling, it must be beneficial, it's unethical for us to continue the study. We have to offer circumcision to the intact group now. We have to close the study and circumcise everybody because it's unethical if we don't do that. So that's after 2 years with a 1.6% decreased chance of getting HIV. They could have followed these men for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and seen, are the results durable? But they stopped the studies after 2 years. So the fact that the early closure really took away the chances for the statistics to really balance out. Now, if you believe the numbers, the authors of the studies themselves have said, well, these numbers are still very high because even in the circumcised group, a 1.3% chance of catching HIV in 2 years, that's enormous compared to our risk as North Americans, okay? So there's still a very high rate of HIV transmission in the circumcised group here in Africa. So the authors said, well, this is not good enough on its own. Everybody has to use condoms as well, okay? So they said, it's very good, we're happy with the results, but it's only useful if you use condoms every single time you have sex. So that was their conclusion after these trials. So they said, use a condom every time you have sex, or cut off part of your penis and use a condom every time you have sex. That was their conclusions, the authors of these studies. And then, of course, now we see